Ay, 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 ra, na, ra, na, ra, ra, na, ra, ra, na, ra, ra, ra. Ha, ra, ra, la, 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 la. La, 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 ra. Ay, ya, ra, ra. Yanda, ra, ra, ra. Ya, 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 ra. Bum, 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 bum. Yum, bum, bum. Okay. Hold on a second. Our daughter just had her birthday yesterday, and one of her birthday gifts is that Nina is taking her to an 80s concert with Belinda Carlisle and other performers from the 80s, and that means I'm on my own, and everything's falling apart. Give me a second here. I need to share the show like Nina usually does at the beginning. I was just sitting here. I realized I didn't have my phone to play the bird. So I said, okay, I'll sing. Then I realized I didn't actually have my book with me because I was preparing inside. Boy. And then, what is the other one I need to share? Daily Dose of Talmud. Okay. I think we're back on track now. Okay, thank you for being patient with me. Let's light up this with this thing. Let's light up the darkness. I'm nothing without Nina. Nothing. That much is clear. Okay. Where am I? Who's in the house on a Sunday night? Bill in Mid-Missouri, Shandor in the Bronx, Paul in the Great Northwest, Melissa in Great Neck, Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon in New Jersey, Joe in the Inland Empire, Paul is listening, Ryan is wishing everyone a good evening, Joseph in Massachusetts, Belle in Texas, Israel in Texas, Bella's in Florida, Karen in Northern California, David in Indiana, Janet in Newburgh. I know Newburgh. Is Newburgh... It's upstate New York. I grew up in New City. Hannah in Texas, Guy in Ohio, Robert in Northern California, Bill. Well, naturally, the minute you're solo is the perfect time for the Kremlins to attack. Just so. Nancy in North Carolina, Leona in Illinois, Paul in Chicago, Bruce in Ecuador. Bienvenido. Elisa, Shalom, Marjorie in Virginia, Aoife in Florida, Yitzhak in Minnesota. Welcome, everybody. I think I've got stuff taken care of. When I take questions at the end, I'll have to scan the comments myself, so that'll take me a moment when we get there. Okay, our daf is page Yud Daled, page 14, here in Tractate Kiddushin, the 20th volume of the Talmud. Today, we're finally going to complete our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 1, and we'll go on to Mishna number 2. We've been talking about, the first Mishna talks about the different ways in which betrothal is created, which technically is called acquisition. A woman is acquired, right, into the state of betrothal. But because that word, kana, king, konen, is used, acquisition, that also, is related to, well, first of all, there's leaving betrothal, right? So leaving marriage, leaving divorce. So in other words, a woman is acquired when she enters marriage. Betrothal is the process that leads to marriage. And then she acquires herself, meaning she leaves the marriage either through divorce or through the death of the husband. And yesterday, we derived specifically from the text, we know that a widow can marry anyone she wants. She is free. She has no lingering bond to the husband that dies that would prohibit her from remarrying. But yesterday, we derived exactly where the text says that. And we continue sort of deriving the underlying basis in the Torah for laws that we know kind of offhand, right? So here we go. The Mishnah teaches, we pick this up at the very bottom of 13b. The Mishnah teaches, and the yevama can be acquired by the deceased husband's brother. The yavam only through intercourse, right? A woman enters betrothal either through money or its equivalent, through a document, or through intercourse. But as we saw, the sages say, yeah, technically you can do it through intercourse, but it's unseemly to enter betrothal in that manner. So by rabbinic decree, they prohibit that. We've talked many times about what is yibum. A woman is married to a man and he dies before he has children. He leaves a brother. So under Torah law, the surviving brother and the widow have a yibum obligation to each other. The concept being that they will marry and their first child is considered the heir of the brother who died. They're not obligated to do this. If they choose not to marry each other, then they must perform a ceremony known as chalitzah, which now releases her to go marry whoever she wants. But she's also released if the yavam, that surviving brother, dies before they perform chalitzah or yibum. Now she is also released. However, if there are other brothers, then she falls for, the yibum obligation remains until she either performs chalitz or yibum with one of the brothers, or all of the brothers were to die, God forbid. Or, of course, if there is no brother, or if her husband had children before he died, then there is no yibum obligation at all. Okay, bottom of 13b. And the yevama can be acquired by the deceased husband's brother, the yavam, only through intercourse. When they have intercourse, the widow and the surviving brother, they become married through that. Now it's a full-blown marriage. They are married after that point. She is his wife, he is her husband. If they want to then break it off, he would have to give her a get. They would need a divorce. But how do we know that the yavam acquires the yevama only through intercourse? Why can't they sort of create a marriage through the same means that are available to a regular couple? Meaning, why can't they use money to create betrothal and then marriage? Why can't they use a document to create betrothal and then marriage? Why does the yavam and the yevama have to perform intercourse in order to create that marriage in that particular situation? And so the Gemara continues, and she acquires herself through chalitzah or through the death of the yavam. Now the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that she can be acquired through intercourse? Well, this is stated explicitly in the Torah. The verse states, her brother-in-law will engage in sexual intercourse with her and take her to him as a wife and perform levirate marriage, yibum, with her. That's Deuteronomy 25:5, which indicates that intercourse renders her his wife. By the way, we don't perform yibum. When this situation occurs, that a woman has a husband who dies, has no kids, leaves a brother, they always perform chalitzah because we don't want they're family, they're close to each other. This is one of those laws that sort of changed over time, and the sages said it doesn't work. It's not good. It's not good for the family that she ends up with the brother, and so we will strongly encourage them to perform chalitzah, strongly to the point of that's what's always done. At any rate, what's the underlying law and how do we know? The Gemara asks, so how do we know that she can be acquired through intercourse? Because the Torah says her brother-in-law will engage in sexual intercourse with her and take her to him as a wife and perform yibum with her, which indicates that intercourse renders her his wife. So the Gemara asks, but one can say that with regard to all matters, she is like a wife, and therefore she can also be acquired with money or a document like any other woman in any other marriage, Jewish marriage. And the Gemara answers, it could enter your mind to say this, as it is taught in a baraisa. It cannot enter your mind to say this. As it is taught in a baraisa, one might have thought that money and a document can complete the acquisition of a yevama and cause her to be married in the manner that intercourse completes her acquisition. Therefore, the verse states, and perform levirate marriage with her, which indicates that only intercourse completes her acquisition, but money or a document do not complete her acquisition. By the way, in ancient times when yibum was practiced, the sages then decreed that even though it was not required by Torah law, but we covered this in Tractate Yevamos, they would create a betrothal first, because for the dignity of the woman who's going to enter into yibum, before they have sex, they should create a betrothal. Not required by Torah law, but the rabbis decreed that, as I recall. Somebody correct me if I'm recalling wrong, but that's what I recall. That's not what's being covered here today. What they're saying here is, in place of the yibum, can you create the full-blown marriage with document with a document or with money, giving her money or giving her money, because she's an adult now. She wouldn't be in her father's house. She was already married to the man's brother. At any rate, this verse teaches us that with money or a document, we do not complete her acquisition. They might sort of do a ritual betrothal first, as it were, but it's only yibum that's going to complete the marriage between the yavam and the yevama. Now, the Gemara asks, but one can say, what is the meaning of, quote, and perform levirate marriage with her? End quote, right? Why is that particular wording used in the Torah? So it teaches that he can perform levirate marriage without her consent, as unlike an ordinary marriage, a levirate marriage does not require the woman's agreement. And the Gemara answers, well, if so, let the verse say, and perform levirate marriage. And one would understand that the matter depends entirely on him. What is the meaning of, and perform levirate marriage with her? Learn two conclusions from this. First, that levirate marriage can be performed against her will, and second, that the only way to acquire a yevama is through sexual intercourse. Now, it's pretty obvious why sexual intercourse is required to create this marriage through yibum. That's what the Torah says. The Torah doesn't say that this happens even against her will. This seems like, whoa. What? How could that be? Are you saying that, okay, this poor woman, she's just experienced the death of her husband. She has this yibum obligation with her brother-in-law. Okay, but she doesn't want to marry the brother-in-law. So, okay, let's perform chalitzah and go our separate ways. But you're telling me that if that brother-in-law rapes her, that then they're married? That this works even against her will? Really? Answer, yes. Yes, and this is one of those situations where they're not talking about the justice or the emotional value of this circumstance. This man will be punished. But what we're asking is, if he rapes her, then an act of sex happened between them. They stood as yavam and yevama. They had sex, even though it was rape. Does that create a marriage? Answer, yes, such that there's going to have to be a get, right? There's going to have to be a bill of divorce so that she's totally free and clear of him. That's just, the implication of that law. The sages are not commenting here on the fact that this is a reprehensible act and this man's going to suffer consequences because of it. But was a marriage created? Yes. And then we have to deal with that legally. Next subject. The Mishna teaches that the yevama acquires herself through chalitzah, right? This is the standard case where a widow has a widow of a man who had died without children, and he left a brother. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this law? The Gemara answers, as it is written with regard to levirate marriage, after the yavam has performed chalitzah, quote, and his name shall be called in Israel the house of him who had his shoe removed. Why? Because the chalitzah ceremony, she takes a shoe off his foot and says, this is the house, this is a man who would not build up his brother's house, and we remove his shoe publicly in front of witnesses, and that is the chalitzah ceremony. So this indicates that once his shoe is removed by her, then she is permitted to all of Israel. She is fully free of this family. She can go marry whoever she wants. Now the Gemara asks, this term, Israel, in this context, does it come to teach this law? It is required for that which is taught by Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda. The verse says, in Israel, to teach that chalitzah may be performed only in a Jewish court, but not in a Gentile court. The Gemara answers that the phrase in Israel is written twice in that chapter, and his name shall be called in Israel at Deuteronomy 25:10, and to establish a name for his brother in Israel at Deuteronomy 25:7. A different law is derived from the use of the word Israel in these two instances in this context. And the Gemara asks, but still we also require the additional term in Israel for that which is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda said. Once we were sitting before Rabbi Tarfon, and a yevama came to perform chalitzah. And Rabbi Tarfon said to us after the chalitzah, all of you should answer and say, the one whose shoe was removed. The one whose shoe was removed. And this indicates that the phrase, and his name shall be called in Israel, from Deuteronomy 25:10, this teaches that the matter must be announced and publicized throughout the nation. And the Gemara answers that law is not derived from the phrase in Israel, rather it is derived from, quote, and his name shall be called, which indicates that it must be announced that this is his name. Bottom line, this is a public ceremony. People know that the yibum law exists in the Torah. So, this poor, let's say she's a young widow. She lost her husband before they had children together. He left a brother, right? The standard course of action. She's not going to marry that brother. They have to perform the chalitzah ceremony. It needs to be known that she performed the chalitzah ceremony so that everyone knows she's now free to marry whoever she wants. She's free of that yibum obligation to the brother. Right. Also, by the way, she's a woman who has performed chalitzah is known as a chalutza. She is a chalutza. And another aspect of that is that she's not permitted to marry a priest. A priest cannot marry a divorced woman, and he cannot marry a woman who performed the chalitzah ceremony, though he could marry a widow. The high priest, the Kohen Gadol, cannot marry a widow or a divorcee. Moving on, new subject. The Mishna further teaches that a yevama is released from levirate marriage and may remarry through the death of the yavam. Now the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this law? And the Gemara answers that it is a kal v'chomer inference. If, with regard to a married woman who is forbidden to other men by a prohibition punished with strangulation, if they commit adultery, and yet the death of her husband renders her permitted, is it not all the more so that with regard to a yevama who is forbidden to other men while the yavam is alive by only a mere prohibition, not a negative commandment that has strangulation as its consequence? Therefore, since the bond between a yevama and a yavam is weaker than the bond between a husband and wife, and a husband and wife, if he dies, she can marry whoever she wants, if they've had kids or there's no surviving brother, then all the more so, a yevama who's only bound to her yavam through the levered obligation, if he dies, of course she must be free. The Gemara raises a difficulty against this kal v'chomer inference. What is unique about a married woman is that she can leave through a get, a bill of divorce as well. Will you say the same with regard to this yevama? She cannot leave the yibum obligation with her yavam by having him write her a bill of divorce. It doesn't apply to that situation. So you can't compare a yevama to a wife in order to make that first kal v'chomer inference work. Right? What is unique about a married woman is that she can leave through a get. Will you say the same with regard to this yevama who cannot leave her yavam through a get? And the Gemara answers, this is an insufficient refutation of the kal v'chomer inference, as this yevama also has the option to leave through chalitzah, which serves the same function as a get. Rather, one can challenge this kal v'chomer inference in a different manner. What is unique about a married woman is that the one who renders her forbidden to everyone else, i.e. her husband, also renders her permitted when he dies. This is not so with regard to a yevama, as she is rendered forbidden upon the death of her husband. Rav Ashi said with regard to this yevama as well, he who renders her forbidden is also the one who renders her permitted. The yavam renders her forbidden because if he was not alive, she would automatically be permitted to other men. Likewise, the yavam renders her permitted through chalitzah, or if he dies. Now the Gemara asks, and let a married woman leave a marriage through chalitzah. Now that we've seen that chalitzah works for a yevama freeing herself of her yibum obligation to her yavam through the ceremony of chalitzah, why not say that a wife could free herself from the bond to her husband through chalitzah? Why do we only have get or death of the husband to free her? Why not also offer the option of chalitzah to a wife who wants to be free of her husband? Where am I? Where'd I go? Yes, and the Gemara asks, and let a married woman leave a marriage through chalitzah as derived by a kal v'chomer inference. If a yevama who cannot leave through a get can leave through chalitzah, is it not logical that this married woman who can leave through a get can likewise leave her husband through chalitzah? And the Gemara answers, obviously this is not going to work, but how do we know it doesn't work? The Gemara says, the verse states with regard to a married woman, a scroll of severance, Deuteronomy 24:3, which indicates that a scroll, i.e. a written document, the get, severs her from her husband and nothing else severs her from him. While the husband is alive, only a get can dissolve a marriage. A chalitzah ceremony cannot do that. The Gemara further asks, and let a yevama leave through a get. Right? Why not give the yevama the option to use a get to be rid of her yavam and the yibum obligation? And you might justify that through the following kal v'chomer inference, right? The kal v'chomer inference works like this. If in such and such a case we have such and such a law, then in a related case where the condition is greater or smaller in the direction that we want to move in, all the more so, we should have the following result, right? That's the kal v'chomer rhythm. And so, why not let a yevama leave her yavam through a get? And here's the kal v'chomer that we might think would work for that. If a married woman who cannot leave through chalitzah can leave through a get, is it not logical that this yevama who can leave through chalitzah can also leave through a get? And the Gemara answers, no, because the Torah states, so shall it be done to the man with regard to the chalitzah of the yevama, and so, the word so precludes another option. Right, the only way out for a yavam and a yevama, either they get married through yibum, or they perform chalitzah and go their separate ways, or if he dies while they have this yibum obligation, there's no other brothers, then she's free to go. The Gemara asks, and is it true that anywhere that there is a term that precludes another option, one cannot learn a kal v'chomer inference? But there is the case of the designation of the goats on Yom Kippur. As it is written, the goat upon which the lot came up for the Lord, right? Remember that at Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol will draw lots, right? One is for Azazel and one is for the Lord of the two Yom Kippur goats. And then the goat, once the lots are chosen for these two goats, now the goats are designated, one to go out and die in the wilderness and one to be slaughtered in the temple. This is where the term the scapegoat comes from. Now, what does it say about this, right? So, the case of the designation of the goats on Yom Kippur, as it is written, Leviticus 16:9, the goat upon which the lot came up for the Lord, and Leviticus 16:34, this shall be an everlasting statute to you, which indicates that everything stated with regard to the commandments of Yom Kippur is critical to the performance of the service of that day. And it is taught in a baraisa that the verse states, Aaron shall bring forward the goat upon which the lot came up for the Lord, and he shall offer it for a sin offering. And the verse indicates that the lottery renders that goat a sin offering, but a verbal designation of the goat with the status of a sin offering does not render it a sin offering. You could call it a sin offering, but the only thing that makes it a sin offering is the fact that the lot for a sin offering came for that goat. And so the baraisa continues. Right? We're going to see how this proof is being developed. The baraisa continues, a verse is necessary to teach this law, as one might have thought that the opposite conclusion is correct. could this not be derived through a kal v'chomer inference as follows? Just as in a case in which the use of a lottery does not affect the consecration of the animals with a specific designation, for example, with regard to a woman who has given birth and must bring 2 birds, one as a sin offering and one as a burnt offering, and nevertheless, a verbal designation of the animals with the required status does affect the consecration of them, so too, in a case in which the use of a lottery does affect the consecration of the animals, is it not logically right that a verbal designation of the animals with the required status should affect the consecration of them? That kal v'chomer does not work. Why? To counter this reasoning, the verse states with regard to the goat, he shall offer it for a sin offering, to indicate that the lottery renders it a sin offering. But a verbal designation of the goat with the status of a sin offering does not turn it into a sin offering. And the reason that a verbal designation is ineffective is that the verse excluded this possibility, from which it may be inferred that if that clause in the verse were not there, one would learn a kal v'chomer inference, even though it is written with regard to its statute. And the same logic should apply in the case of chalitzah, i.e., the term so in this verse should not prevent one from learning a kal v'chomer inference, and therefore it might be argued that a yevama can be released through a get, you might have thought. Rather, the Gemara explains that here too there is a limitation derived from a verse. The verse states with regard to a get, and write for her a scroll of severance. The husband will write for her a scroll of severance to end the marriage. For her, the words for her, this is a limitation, which teaches a get is effective for a regular woman, but not for a yevama. And the Gemara asks, but one can say that the phrase for her should be interpreted differently. It should be interpreted to indicate that the get must be written for her sake and not for someone else. If you're learning out from those 2 words, for her, that the get had to be written for her sake and not just a random template or for some other woman who had the same name, then you've already used those extraneous words in the verse, for her, to learn a law. So how can you say that we're going to learn from those words a different teaching, namely that the get won't work for a yevama, it only works for a wife? So the Gemara answers, for her is written twice in the law of divorce and betrothal, and therefore both laws can be derived. And the Gemara asks, and still one instance of for her is required to teach that the get must be written for her sake, and the other instance of for her is needed to teach for her and not both for her and for another, i.e. for her rival wife. One get cannot be used for 2 women. So now, okay, it says for her twice, but now we've got 2 things that we need to learn out from that, so it's not free to teach us this other teaching that we're looking for. So rather, the Gemara suggests a different explanation as to why a get is ineffective for a yevama. With regard to a yevama, the verse states, the house of him who had his shoe removed, Deuteronomy 25:10, which teaches, if she is released by the chalitzah of the shoe, yes, she is released from the yavam. But if she was released by means of something else, like this get that you want to try and use in this situation, no, she is not released. So the Gemara keeps challenging, but this term shoe, does it come to teach this? The term shoe in this verse is necessary for that which is taught in a different baraisa. The verse said, and remove his shoe. And I have derived only that his shoe may be used. From where do I derive that the shoe of any person may also be used for the chalitzah ceremony? And the verse states shoe, and states again in the next verse shoe, which includes any other shoe. Well, if so, what is the meaning when the verse states his shoe, which is apparently referring to the shoe of that particular man? How can you say that you could use a shoe that doesn't belong to him? Well, this teaches that it must be his shoe, meaning that it is fit for him, excluding a shoe that is so large that he cannot walk in it, and excluding a shoe that is so small that it does not cover most of his foot, and excluding sandals that have no heels, which do not qualify as shoes. And the Gemara answers, well, if so, that the term is stated only for that purpose, then let the verse write shoe, What is the meaning of the shoe? Learn the two previously stated conclusions from that extra article, the. Now we're on page 14b, and I am happy to tell you that we have completed our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1. Here is Mishnah number 2 of chapter 1. A Hebrew slave, nikene, right, is acquired. A Hebrew slave can be acquired by his master through money or through a document, and he can acquire himself, meaning he is emancipated, he leaves slavery, through years, i.e. when he completes his 6 years of labor, or through the advent of the Jubilee year, or through the deduction of money. The slave can redeem himself through during the 6 years by paying for his remaining years of slavery, right? The price that was paid to bring him into slavery minus the pro rata amount to cover the years he's already served. He could pay that money to the master and go free. A Hebrew maid servant has an additional mode of emancipation that the Hebrew male slave does not have, because she acquires herself through signs indicating puberty. A slave who is pierced after serving 6 years, this is a male slave, is acquired as a slave for a longer period through piercing his ear with an awl. There's a law about that. The Hebrew slave wants to remain enslaved. He has an option to do that by putting his ear up against a door frame, and they pierce his ear in a certain way, and that's a ritual where he has asked to remain enslaved. We'll talk more about that. And the Hebrew male slave acquires himself through the arrival of the Jubilee year every 50 years, right, when the temple is standing and these practices were in effect, or through the death of the master. That's Mishnah number 2. So before I continue, since this Mishnah is all about how Hebrew slaves are acquired and how they go free, let me just read a little background that makes this whole area of law a little bit clearer before we dive into the discussion of it. So here's Rav Steinsaltz explaining the law of the Hebrew slave. A Hebrew slave is an adult male Jew who becomes the slave of another Jew. There are 2 ways in which a Jew can enter into slavery. The court may sell a thief into slavery if he does not possess the means to make restitution for his theft. Exodus 22:2. Or, if a Jew becomes impoverished, he may choose to sell himself to seek relief from his poverty. Leviticus 25:39. A Hebrew slave sold by the court, right, because he was a thief, is emancipated after serving his master for 6 years. Exodus 21:2. In the event of his master's death, a Hebrew slave is required to continue serving his master's son until the end of the period for which he was sold. If the master had no sons, the slave is not obligated to continue serving other heirs. On Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, that comes every 50 years, all Hebrew slaves are emancipated irrespective of how long they have served. Leviticus 25:40. When a Hebrew slave attains his freedom, his master or his master's heirs must give him a severance gift. Deuteronomy 15:13 and 14. A Hebrew slave may also attain his freedom by paying his master the value of the remainder of the term for which he was sold. With regard to a slave who becomes ill or incapacitated, if the period of his illness is less than 3 years, his slavery is not extended. If a Hebrew slave has a wife and children, his master is obligated to provide for them as well. According to some authorities, they, the wife and children, in turn are obligated to provide the master with the same work and earnings that they would give their husband and father. When a Hebrew slave who is married and has children is sold by the court, his master is entitled to provide him with a Canaanite maidservant with whom to live. If she bears children, if the Canaanite maidservant bears children, they become the property of the master and have no legal connection with their biological father. Exodus 21:4. In all other respects, the Hebrew slave has all the obligations of a free Jew and is bound by the positive and negative commandments. Should the Hebrew slave sold by the court desire to remain with his master, perhaps due to his love for the Canaanite maidservant and her children, after the 6 years of his slavery are concluded, he must undergo a ceremonial rite involving the piercing of his ear. Afterward, he remains a slave until Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year or the death of his master. It is the slave's right to insist on undergoing the piercing ceremony, but this is strongly discouraged. It is prohibited to give a Hebrew slave humiliating work, even if there are free men willing to perform those tasks. It is likewise prohibited to overwork him. In all matters, for example, food and sleeping quarters, the Hebrew slave and his family must be treated like the master himself. All right, that's some background on the law of the Hebrew slave who is owned by a Jew. The Gemara on Mishnah number 2. The Mishnah teaches that a Hebrew slave can be acquired through money. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive this law? The Gemara answers that the verse states out of the money that he was bought for, Leviticus 25:51, which teaches that he can be acquired through money. And the Gemara asks, we found that a Hebrew slave who is sold to a Gentile is acquired with money, which is the case discussed in that verse, but this proves nothing with regard to a Jew sold to a Jew. One could argue that since all of the acquisitions of a Gentile are performed only with money, he can likewise purchase a Hebrew slave with money. But from where do we derive that a Hebrew slave can be sold to a Jew with money? Again, this has not been practiced in thousands of years, but when slavery was in practice thousands of years ago, this is how it was done. The Gemara explains that with regard to a Hebrew maidservant, right, the young Hebrew female slave, a Jewish female slave, the verse states, then he shall let her be redeemed, Exodus 21:8, which teaches that if she acquires money and wishes to be emancipated before her time is complete, she deducts a sum for her redemption. The maidservant can deduct the value of time served from her purchase price and pay the remaining amount, and she is then emancipated. And this teaches that a Hebrew maidservant is acquired through money, a law that applies to the male slave as well. The Gemara asks, although we found this law with regard to a Hebrew maidservant, one cannot extrapolate from there to this case, as it is possible that it applies only to a female. The reason for this is that since she is ordinarily, a Jewish woman is ordinarily betrothed through money, right? You give her some money. It's not you're purchasing her, right? It can be a very small amount of money, but that has to be that money transferred. That's how betrothal is created. We learned that in Mishnah number 1. So, since a woman can ordinarily be betrothed through money for marriage, she can also be acquired as a maidservant through money. But from where do we derive that a Hebrew male slave can likewise be acquired through money? He is not acquired through money when he enters betrothal. So the Gemara answers that the verse states, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, and he shall serve you 6 years. And this verse juxtaposes a Hebrew man to a Hebrew woman, indicating that the modes through which they are acquired are the same. So the Gemara asks again, we found a source in this verse for a slave who is sold by the court. Why is a slave sold by the court? Because he's a thief who didn't have the money to pay back what he stole. So the court will sell him to a Hebrew master for this indentured servitude of 6 years. I'm not sure if a court would sell somebody into slavery because he got into a debt that was so huge that he couldn't pay it. That certainly happened in the secular world. I don't know if we haven't covered that yet here, so I don't know about that. Now the Gemara for us. So we found this source for a slave who is sold by court. So this verse is referring to a thief, who is unable to repay the value of his theft and is sold as a slave so that he can repay his debt. One can therefore argue that this case is unique since he is sold against his will. I mean, he deserves it. He's a thief who stole and can't pay back what he stole. But nevertheless, being sold into slavery is against his will. So from where do we derive that one who sells himself, right? He sells himself. He's so impoverished that he's not going to be able to eat. He's facing starvation. So he'd rather sell himself to a master who's then going to be obligated to feed and shelter him. He'll have to work, but he will survive. So from where do we derive that one who sells himself can be sold through money? The Gemara answers, one derives this through a verbal analogy between the terms hired worker and hired worker. This phrase is used in two different verses, and we're going to learn now the connection. This term appears both with regard to one who sells himself, Leviticus 25:40, as a hired worker, and as a settler he shall be with you, and with regard to one who is sold by the court. For double of the hire of a hired worker he has served you, Deuteronomy 15:18. So the Gemara asks, this works out well according to the one who derives this verbal analogy between the terms hired worker and hired worker. But according to the one who does not derive the verbal analogy between hired worker and hired worker, what can be said? From where does he derive that one who sells himself can sell himself for money? The Gemara answers, the verse states at the start of the passage dealing with one who is sold to a Gentile, quote, and if a stranger who is a settler among you becomes rich, Leviticus 25:47, the conjunction and in this phrase, in this verse, serves to add to the first matter, i.e., the passage discussing one who sells himself to a Jew, as it joins the two issues. And therefore, let the above case of one who sells himself to a Jew be derived from the case below of one who is sold to a Gentile. Meaning, just as one who is sold to a Gentile can be acquired with money, so too one who sells himself to a Jew can be acquired with money. And the Gemara comments, and who is the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishnaic period, who does not derive the verbal analogy between hired worker and hired worker? It is this Tana, as it is taught in a Baraisa, one who sells himself as a slave is sold for 6 years. And if he wishes, he can be sold for more than 6 years. Whereas one who is sold by the court may only be sold for 6 years. Interesting. One who sells himself can sell himself for more than 6 years, at least according to that Tana. But one who is sold by the court cannot be sold for more than 6 years, even if he stole much more money and, can't pay it back. The Baraisa adds that there are additional differences between these two slaves. One who sells himself may not be pierced with an awl. He does not have the option to remain enslaved, even if he wants to. Whereas one who is sold by the court may be pierced with an awl. If he wants to, can remain enslaved to his master. One who sells himself is not granted a severance gift by his master when he is emancipated, whereas one who is sold by the court is granted a severance gift. With regard to one who sells himself, his master may not provide him with a Canaanite maidservant as a wife to produce slave children. Whereas with regard to one who is sold by the court, his master may provide him with a Canaanite maidservant. And what is the law about that? A Hebrew slave who sold himself is prohibited from engaging in sexual intercourse with a maidservant. But one who was sold by the court may be given a Canaanite maidservant by his master. I'm approaching the end. If you've got questions or comments, get them in. Rabbi Elazar says that there is no difference between these two types of slaves, the one who sells himself into slavery and the one who is sold by a court. Rather, both this slave and that slave may be sold for only 6 years. Both this one and that one may be pierced with an awl. Both this one and that one are granted a severance gift. And in both this case and that case, his master may provide him with a Canaanite maidservant. What? Is it not the case that they disagree with regard to this, that the first Tana does not derive the verbal analogy between hired worker and hired worker, and Rabbi Elazar does derive the verbal analogy between hired worker and hired worker? If one holds that the two cases are juxtaposed, one will equate the law of both slaves, the one who sells himself and the one who is sold by the court. This is the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, in contrast to the opinion of the first Tana, who holds that the laws of each type of slave are different. Rav Tav Yume said in the name of Abaye, that is not so. You've misunderstood this whole thing. Rather, everyone derives the verbal analogy between hired worker and hired worker. And here in the dispute in our Baraisa, they disagree about this following verse. What is the reasoning of the first Tana, who says that one who sells himself is sold for 6 years and more than 6 years if he wishes? So he maintains that with regard to one sold by the court, the merciful one excludes a certain case by the verse, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, and he shall serve you 6 years. And that teaches that only this type of slave serves for 6 years and no more. But the same does not apply to one who sells himself. If he so stipulates, he may serve for more than 6 years. And the Gemara explains, and the other, Rabbi Lazar, learns a different law from this verse, and he shall serve you, means that he works for you and not for an heir of this master other than his son. If a master has no sons, his slave is not transferred as an inheritance to a daughter or to a brother like his other property. If he does have sons, they inherit the Hebrew slave. And the Gemara asks, and the other, the first Tana, from where does he derive that a slave is not transferred as an inheritance to an inheritor who is not the man's son? And the Gemara answers that the phrase, and he shall serve you, is written another time, and he derives this law from there. So then the Gemara asks, and the other Tana, Rabbi Lazar, what does he do with this other verse? The Gemara answers, in his opinion, that verse comes to appease the master. The verse emphasizes that the servitude is of limited duration to encourage the master to free the slave without hesitation, right? It's to underscore to the master, you don't own your fellow Jew. He's serving you for 6 years. You treat him properly. You feed him and give him shelter at the same level that you enjoy. And when the 6 years are up, without hesitation, you let him go and you give him a parting gift. And it's not just like, a Timex, right? You let him go out in style so that he's going to be able to set himself up and get back on his feet. That's what we have for today. Let me scan questions. It's a little bit difficult. Usually Nina passes me the questions through our Google Doc. Let me just scan here. One day Sal's going to hit the bell so hard it will fly off the books. LOL. The reason that it's on the books is just so that it's at the same height. My desk is lower, and if I didn't have these 3 volumes of Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, it would be too low. You guys know that Nina and I made a movie about Abraham Lincoln, right? It's called Saving Lincoln. You can find it on Apple and on Prime, and I'm sure you will enjoy it. We're very proud of it. Okay. Catherine says, I love your lessons. Kit from Oregon. Thank you so much. Duncan from Alabama. She has a question. Joe, if a raped woman can't get a get, how does she acquire herself? Does her yevama have to face capital punishment? Can he be forced into chalitzah in the Beis Din? In the Bet Din. So we were talking about this earlier law that's very discomforting, right? That if we have the widow, her husband died before he had children, he left a brother. The normal course of things is, in the old times, she and the brother could perform yibum and get married. That eventually was strongly discouraged by the sages, so they would just normally perform chalitzah. But if the yavam raped the yevama, the law is that they're married, right? That creates marriage because the sexual act was performed. Now, that is the technical outcome of that act. He still is going to face consequences under other body of law. But Joe is asking, well, wait a minute. Okay, so he raped her. Obviously, this guy is, not a nice person we're dealing with, not someone we can expect to play ball, as it were. So now, because it is a unilateral right of the husband to give the get, to create the divorce, he could have just let her perform chalitzah and let her go. Instead, he raped her. We can't assume that he's going to give her the get. However, we've seen that we can force a husband to give a get, right? A court has the power to coerce, literally to torture the husband until he says, okay, I want to give her the get. He actually has to say those words. And then he gives her the get, and then they're divorced. So this would be, for sure, a situation where they would force him to give the get, and then she would go her way. The problem is it's not a problem. It's just that because legally they created marriage, we have to go through that process of making him give the get. As for the rape, he's going to suffer consequences on another body of law. It's a separate question that's addressed somewhere else in the Gemara. Can a husband rape his wife? Right? That is a complex, nuanced question it's just outside the scope of this class right now. Here, what we were talking about is, did the yavam create marriage by raping the yevama? The answer is yes, and then we have to deal with that, and it, the court will impose consequences on that. Okay. So Joseph says the parallel to the goat for Azazel is fascinating, that we learned out, in terms of verbal designation. We looked at the law of Yom Kippur, that we have, they draw lots to see which goat is going to be slaughtered as a sin offering in the temple when the temple is standing, and which goat is going to be sent out to Azazel in the wilderness as the scapegoat that bears all our sins away, as it were. And that they can't just say, okay, you know what, we don't feel like doing the lottery. Something went wrong with the lottery. We lost the paddles for the lottery. Okay, so just say that one's for the sin offering and that one is for Azazel. No, can't do it. Must do the lottery. And from that, we learned out how that applied here. And Bill says, no, we were unaware you made a Lincoln movie. What with the poster behind it? Touche. Okay, let me check over there. Aoife says, did I miss the argument against chalitzah being used to dissolve marriage because chalitzah is used in lieu of acquiring the wife, while divorce applies only after the wife is acquired in one of three ways? So chalitzah only applies to break off the yevama obligation. They said you might have thought that, a yevama who cannot be freed with a get, nevertheless is freed with chalitzah. So a wife who can be freed with a get, all the more so, she could also be freed with chalitzah. But they disprove that basically by saying that the Torah provides for chalitzah to end the yavam and yevama obligation. It's specifically for that situation. It cannot be used for a wife. And likewise, if the marriage was created through yibum, right? Like, let's say that the yavam and the yevama were thinking this over, right? The husband died, some time has passed, the yevama, right, the widow, and the yavam, the brother-in-law, are thinking about, do they want to marry, do they not? Some time passes, they're sort of getting to know each other a little bit. They're going to decide whether they want to do this or not. They have a few drinks. They sleep together. The next morning they wake up like, this is a bad idea. Let's just perform chalitzah. Too late. They got married when they slept together the night before. That was yibum. Now chalitzah is off the table. If they want to part company, he has to give her a get because they are now a fully married couple. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll get it again tomorrow, Monday, for page 15 at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.